Hello, and welcome to Joe and Kat Chats. Oh my gosh, today we are talking about the Fourth Geneva Convention. We are recording live. It is May 18th, 2021. We're on Facebook, we're on YouTube at /JoeNiceDJ. Find us on all socials at Joe and Kat Chats or on our personal pages at JoeNiceDJ and at CatWells22. And we're also happy to be part of Tastemakers Radio on the Dash Radio app. Listen every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern. And as always, I am excited to get into it today. But first, how are you, Joe?
You know, Miss Wells, I am as good as I'm going to be. There's a lot happening around the world, geopolitically, socially, economically, etc. I want to have a brief discussion about my garments that I am wearing today. I wanted to talk about that because so much of our conversations that we've done over the previous 48 episodes have been focused and centered on intersectionality. We have spoken on many occasions about internationalizing the struggle. So I want to go ahead and make sure I live up to the ideals and morals of our enterprise right now, the greatest podcast in the history of podcasts, Joe and Kat Chats. First of all, forthcoming on the clothing line. This right here is the Foresight shirt, but it is in Spanish. Humanidad, Libertad, Igualdad, and Supervivencia. I'm wearing this to show solidarity to everybody in Colombia right now who is fighting for these four ideals: humanity, freedom, equality, and survival, but in your language, Espanol, Spanish. Okay? There are plenty of people that are going through the struggles of humanity, freedom, equality, survival right now in Colombia. I know plenty of people down there who are going through it right now in many ways. My solidarity and my support is fully there. And Ms. Wells, I'm sure you feel the same way.
Absolutely.
Additionally, I am wearing a kufiya in full and unadulterated solidarity with our Palestinian brothers and sisters. What is happening right there is an atrocity that should never have taken place at all. It shouldn't be happening. It should not be sanctioned by any country, nor should the United States and Canada be funding a genocidal state like Israel. That should not be happening by any circumstances. What is happening there is an abomination. These are war crimes. These are crimes against humanity. It is shameful. It is disgusting. And we need to continue the pressure campaigns among my government, your government, and all governments that continue to either be silent or be complicit with the murder and brutalization of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and West Bank and East Jerusalem. So what we are going to do today is going to discuss a lot of what's happening in the Fourth Geneva Convention. We're going to discuss a lot of terminology that you hear nowadays and you see on social media and that you might hear on radio broadcasts, podcasts, and the news, etc. And we're going to try to break everything down. But before we try to break everything down and have everybody dissect and absorb all of the information that we're going to provide to everybody over the next 56 minutes and 30 seconds, how are you, Ms. Wells?
Oh my gosh. Thank you for saying all of that. I absolutely agree with all of that. And I think, okay, so I want to just start by saying, again, this week I feel unprepared because all of the things that we're talking about are such complex issues. And I don't mean to say that to deflect or discount what reality is, which is that, Israel is, a colonial state that is ethnically cleansing Palestine. And absolutely, that is something we need to talk about. But when I was considering how I wanted to approach today, I've just been feeling really emotional about what's been in the news regarding Israel and Palestine, what's been going on for the last over a week. And I think I've come to the conclusion or sort of realized that the reason, the reason why I am so emotional about this issue, given that, I'm personally not Palestinian or Israeli. I don't know very many Palestinians or Israelis personally. I have, only a couple of Palestinian folks that I would consider friends, and one a inspiring mentor for my undergraduate institution. But I think the reality is that learning about Israel and Palestine is really what radicalized me several years ago, probably more like a decade ago or more, which is aging me. But yeah, I think that that's kind of what I've realized over the last little while. Because I mean, in 2014, there was a really deadly, I guess, outbreak of the conflict between Israel and Palestine. And I mean, that was already years after I'd been sort of radicalized by this information and the existence of this quote unquote conflict. And so this time I kind of just was like, oh, I feel the same way. And it's really emotional. I mean, there's been 218 Palestinians that have died over the last week in this. I don't want to call it a conflict, but I'm using that language. Anyway, I think it was 58. I didn't write it down, but I think it was 58 of those 218 are children. And there's only been 10 Israelis that have died. So I just want to start with that because I think it's really important to remember the power dynamics, which I think we're going to talk about more, because of the circumstances surrounding this fight, which I again hesitate to call a quote unquote conflict because it provides, I guess, the insinuation that it's a fair fight, which it's not. Joe, you're muted.
Thanks for saying all that, and I appreciate everything you just said, and understand and respect everything you just said. And obviously, I don't want to see any loss of life, regardless of who dies, is tragic because it's a human life. You know, you only get one, regardless of where your political ideologies are. But it's another thing when children needlessly die. It's another thing when children needlessly die. When I shared that video of that 10-year-old girl on my Instagram, I have a 10-year-old daughter. I have a 10-year-old, and my ex-wife adopted a 5-year-old girl, and I'm not her biological dad, but you know, we have a close relationship, and I could not imagine children living in a war zone and having to and playing kickball with their friends one minute and having to go to a bomb shelter or run inside their house and hope that a missile doesn't hit their home.
Yeah.
That is unimaginable. That is unthinkable. And something needs to be done about this. The pressure campaign that we're seeing in dozens, if not over 100 countries around the world, the continued protests that we are seeing in hundreds of cities around the United States, around the world. In fact, today I will be attending a protest and a vigil. I just found out about this about an hour ago. I had some people message me earlier, about an hour ago. I'll be attending a demonstration today at North Carolina State University. Takes place at 6:30 p.m. So if you're watching, if you're in the Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, Carrboro, Cary, Morrisville, Wake Forest, if you're anywhere around the area, come by. It's at North Carolina State University. It is at Stafford Square, the Stafford Commons on the campus of North Carolina University. Come there. Please show up. Please be respectful, and show your support for the Palestinian people.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
And before we go on, I just want to mention that if you're curious about what's going on for this particular, I guess, issue that's arisen in sort of the news and all of the calls for a ceasefire between Israel and Palestine. I did an overview of like what caused this particular conflict this time in last week's episode, which I encourage everyone to go and listen to. Yeah. So yeah, I guess let's just get into it, because I mean there's a lot to talk about today, Joe.
We have a lot to cover in a short period of time. I said this earlier on my public service and outlet videos that I've been doing recently after I work out. I said this is going to be one of the more academic and emotional episodes we're going to do, because there's so much subject matter to cover and a short time to do it. So we're going to jump right into it. And we're going to dive in head first, because that's the only way to dive into anything. Earlier on, we said that Israel is an apartheid state. But so many people hear the word apartheid and kind of have an idea of what it is, but don't really know the definition of apartheid and its etymology. So we're going to go ahead and give a definition for that. Apartheid is a system of segregation and discrimination based on race. Simple as that. Now, apartheid is a South African word, and South Africa instituted this racist policy in South Africa and Southwest Africa, which is now known as current-day Namibia, in 1948 until the 1990s. Now, apartheid in South Africa was based on a caste, or what is called a social stratification system, where white people, the minority in terms of population, were the highest level on the social stratification system. Number two, or second-class citizens, were Asians. And third on the social stratification system during the apartheid state in South Africa were Black people.
Yeah, I mean, that's really telling, especially given what we talk about and have talked about for the last, 49 weeks of this podcast, which is mind-boggling to me that we've been going for this long. But yeah, I mean, there is a distinction that I've been sort of, I guess, talking about more frequently recently between whiteness and white people, but they are also an intertwined thing. And so when we're talking about social hierarchies, we're talking about like literal physical traits, but we're also talking about the internalized whiteness that anybody can internalize and uphold these systemic issues of oppression.
Absolutely. And as I've said before, and I will say again, I will continue to beat this drum, there's that famous introduction to a speech that Dr. Cornel West did. The introduction was by Dr. David Lee, where he said, race is biological social irrelevance with fatal social consequences. Yeah. Please, if there's nothing that any of you listeners or viewers have learned in the 49 weeks we've been doing this podcast, if you take one thing away, just remember that. Remember that. Race is biological social irrelevance with fatal social consequences. And some of these fatal social consequences lead to persecution. Yeah. And persecution is defined as the mistreatment of one group of people by another group of people. In most cases, persecution comes as in religious persecution, political persecution, or, as we just previously discussed, racial persecution. Yeah. Now, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say the definition I found for persecution also included the word hostility and ill treatment. So I just wanted to highlight that, because I think that is an interesting pairing of words.
Absolutely. It is. And that let's get ready for this word. That collocation is you see that frequently. Collocation. That's one of those linguistics words. We actually talked about that in, guess what? The language episode of Joe and Cat Chat. So you can always go back and listen to that. Now, a word that commonly is seen with persecution is oppression. And that's a word that we've used dozens of times on this show. And oppression is long-term abuse and misuse of power by governmental authority. And it's designed to mistreat an individual or a group of people. Now, examples of oppression include racial oppression, oppression based on gender, class, and economic oppression.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting because, I mean, one word that stuck out to me was the word power.
Yes.
And in the definition that I brought up with oppression is also the word control.
Yes.
And so these things are sort of interwoven into oppression.
They are.
Now, go ahead.
No, you got it. You're driving the bus. Go ahead.
I was going to say, now, I mean, power is the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others.
Yes.
Or the course of events.
Yes.
So you can see how these things are intertwined and really related, I guess.
Yeah, there's obvious connections. Some of the other definitions that I had for power are the right to do something, strength or force, or social, political, or economic control. Power.
Right. There's that word again, control.
Control. And and you mentioned the word interwoven, how there's a connectedness between power and oppression and all of the and racism and persecution and apartheid. There's a famous sociologist named Patricia Hill Collins, and she wrote a book called Black Feminist Thought. And in the book, she discussed the Matrix of Domination. Now, the Matrix of Domination focuses on social oppression through macro and micro levels that happens through, there it is, perfect. And of course, you would have the book because you being a sociology major.
I'm reading it still.
You're still reading. There you go. And it talks about oppression on macro and micro levels through 4 domains of power: structural, disciplinary, hegemonic, and interpersonal. Now, think about everything that we've talked about in the introduction to this show with respect to Colombia and Palestine, and how there's 4 domains of power: structural, disciplinary. Look at how the police and military are attacking Palestinians from the Israeli side, and the Colombian police are shooting other Colombian citizens. Look at the hegemony that is taking place, where you have, and hegemony is described as one state controlling another. Take a look at Israel controlling Palestine. Look at the interpersonal situations that are taking place in each of these states. So those 4 domains: structural, disciplinary, hegemonic, and interpersonal, they share common characteristics, and they continue to uphold inequalities across the board.
Absolutely. And I will say, I mean, Joe, you came up with the outline for today. And obviously, I was very interested in this point because I'm a sociologist by education. So, I mean, of course, Patricia Hill Collins is one of my favorite folks as a sociologist. And so I wanted to just really define and outline exactly what these 4 domains of power are within the matrix of domination. So structural power organizes oppression in society. So what that means is basically it's interlocking large-scale social institutions that reproduce the subordination of Black women, for example, according to Collins, because her research revolves around Black women.
And she's a Black woman.
Of course, yeah, she is herself. So hegemonic or cultural power is the system of ideas developed by a dominant group that justifies their practices, which is sort of through ideology, culture, consciousness, the beliefs of the dominant group, which get normalized as sort of these common sense ideas that support their position. So that just sort of like, you gave a perfect example before. Disciplinary power manages oppression through power relations and control of subpopulations through organizational practices of social institutions. So, for example, like government bureaucracies and surveillance technologies, which we can talk about in reference to Israel, of course,
Yes.
and the United States and Canada as well, all participating in mass surveillance. And then interpersonal power is how our individual consciousness perpetuates the subordination of others. So this is through like routinized daily practices of interaction at sort of the micro level, which means like conversation, people you interact with throughout the day, and individuals uphold the subordination that we're talking about with these power dynamics with others.
Yeah. And the interesting part about this is the word that Professor Collins used. She said matrix. And another word that you've used is interwoven. And another word that I'm going to use that's going to connect everything together is one of our favorite terminologies, intersectionality. And of course, we've used this word dozens of times before, created by University of California at Berkeley sociologist Kimberly Crenshaw. And what happens with intersectionality is varied identities meet to create shared forms of discrimination, disadvantage, and privilege. And it creates this overlap where race, gender, and class creates interdependent systems of discrimination. And when I was doing some of my research about this earlier today and over this past weekend, what you see with the matrix of domination and social oppressions in the four domains of power and the very definition of intersectionality is that dismantling these systems of oppression becomes more difficult because you then have to somehow dismantle the roles that you occupy as a human being. And how do you disassociate yourself from the roles that you occupy as a human being, and then try to disassociate or dismantle these institutionalized systems of oppression that pervade our world today? It becomes considerably more difficult. That's why when you hear people say that, why you see books, why there was a book, why is it so difficult to talk about race? Or we had a conversation about dealing with white fragility. Why is it difficult to talk about these things? Well, it's difficult to talk about these situations because you have the matrix of domination that is woven into the fabric of society. And then you have people that make up a society that occupy various social norms and roles. And it becomes incredibly difficult to separate the two. Those two are the roles that we play, and the systems of oppression are unfortunately inextricably linked. And separating them it becomes a painful process.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a couple of things to say in response to that. One is that, I mean, this is just reminding me of the reason why Canada and the United States, particularly the two countries we reside in, are really slow to respond to what's going on in Israel and Palestine right now, and they're really just waiting it out and not really taking a stand on the literal colonial oppression and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians by the state of Israel. Yes. And one of the reasons for that is because if we as Canadians or Americans admit that Israel is a colonial oppressive state, then we have to admit that our countries are also that. And so then it becomes this complex thing that we have to untangle for ourselves. And I don't think that our governments or anyone that is sort of leading our countries is ready to do that. We can't publicly admit to like the travesties ongoing in Israel because we have the same shit going on here with indigenous folks, with, I mean, why the fuck aren't we paying reparations for American descendants of slaves? Because we won't admit that that's is still an ongoing issue through the 13th Amendment and the prison industrial complex, which is related to the military industrial complex. Like, these are things we talk about all the time, but I think it's really important to sort of bring them together and look at how, like, I talk about how things are so complex all the time, but it's so true. They're interwoven, they're intertwined in these really complex ways that produce circumstances that really we're not ready to untangle
They produce
as
circumstances.
political leaders.
Yeah,
Sorry,
they produce. No, it's okay. They produce circumstances that are bigger than the institutions they came from.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
It's Dr. Frankenstein creating the monster, and the monster is out of control, and Dr. Frankenstein can't control that monster anymore. Mm-hmm. That is what we are dealing with. Yeah. And then when you have these interconnected systems that are rooted in power and apartheid and persecution and oppression, what you end up is the process of making one group or one class of people less important or peripheral or lower class or secondary. And that is a term that we've used on these conversations. That word is called marginalization. Mm-hmm. That is marginalization. When in the words of Bob Marley from the song War, when you make one group of people superior and another inferior, that is marginalization. And we are seeing that around the world on a day-to-day basis, and not solely limited to just Colombia and Palestine and the United States and Canada. We're seeing it all over the world. We've discussed this ad nauseum, and we will continue to do so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
So, yeah, marginalization, the definition is really just a treatment of a person, group, or concept as insignificant or peripheral. Mm-hmm. Simple as that. Huge impact. Oh,
no, it's okay. No, it's okay. All good. It's all good. Now, I know we have almost about 30 minutes left, and the next part of what we want to talk about is really going to be the meat and potatoes of this conversation, because there's a lot to discuss. There's a lot of terminology that we're going to bring your way. There's a lot of information and content from previous episodes that we will refer to, because it's important to the context of everything that we're going to talk about. What we want to do is go into the discussion of everything that is happening with respect to Palestine and Israel. There are three words. I know you're going to provide the definitions for them. There are three words that we've seen used in the conversation over the past week. We've seen these words: anti-Semitism, we've seen Zionism, and anti-Zionism. And it's important to understand what these words are, how they apply to what is happening geopolitically, specifically to Israel and Palestine. So there's a better understanding and a better framework and frame of reference to educate yourself about what is happening in the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I appreciate you saying all of that. And you actually sent me a post that I actually am going to read verbatim because I think it does a really good job of defining all of this. So the recently released Jerusalem definition on anti-Semitism makes it abundantly clear that support for anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitic. The JDA lists examples of beliefs that are not, on their face, anti-Semitic, including, quote, criticizing or opposing Zionism as a form of nationalism, or arguing for a variety of constitutional arrangements for Jews and Palestinians in the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, end quote. So in the FAQs, the JDA goes on to note that, quote, the two concepts, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, are categorically different. Nationalism, Jewish or otherwise, can take many forms, but it is always debatable, end quote. So we have to define what anti-Semitism is, which is the form of ideological oppression that targets Jewish people in Europe and United States. It has functioned to protect the prevailing economic system and the almost exclusively Christian ruling class by diverting blame for hardships onto Jewish people. Like all oppressions, it has deep historical roots and uses exploitation, marginalization, discrimination, and violence as its tools. Like all oppressions, the ideology contains elements of dehumanization and degradation via lies and stereotypes about Jewish people, as well as mythology. The myth changes and adapts to different times and places, but fundamentally it says that Jewish people are to blame for society's problems. Which I encourage everyone to go back and re-listen to that definition and think about what we just talked about for the first 30 minutes of this episode, because there's definitely some links. So Zionism is the movement that led to the founding of the State of Israel. Founded in Europe, Zionism was envisioned as a response to the anti-Semitic persecution faced by Jewish people in Europe. From the beginning, Zionist movements featured deep ideological debate and disagreement around what the state should look like, what its relationship should be towards the local Arab Palestinian population, and other issues. So Jewish opposition to Zionism. There's been a long history of Jewish opposition to Zionism, as old as the Zionist movement itself. Throughout the 20th century, Jewish movements like the Bund in Eastern Europe and the Reform movement in America, the Anti-Zionist League in Iraq, and more opposed Zionism for a variety of political, cultural, and religious reasons. Today, many Jewish folks identify as non- or anti-Zionist out of a commitment to Palestinian freedom and rights. Anti-Zionism opposes an exclusive ethno-state in the land of Israel, Palestine, which I will just say, the land is Palestine. Israel is occupying that land. So Zionism led to the Nakba, which the anniversary was this past Saturday. I hope everyone recognized that and potentially, attended, if you could attend the rallies. There was many rallies. It's been 54 years since Nakba. And this was where nearly 1 million Palestinians were expelled or were pushed out of their homes during the founding of Israel in 1948. Palestinian families were massacred, villages were bombed. Israel continues to oppress and displace Palestinians today, which again, go back to last week's episode, and I did an overview of what's going on right now over the last couple of weeks. Many anti-Zionists themselves are Jewish folks who oppose Israel's oppression of Palestinians, their marginalization of Mizrahi, Ethiopian, and other non-Ashkenazi Jewish people. I don't know how to speak Hebrew, so my apologies if I got any of those names wrong. And also political ties with anti-Semitic leaders and governments. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, the current governments of the United States and Canada. So what Zionism means to Palestinians. For over a century, Palestinians have opposed the Zionist movement and the creation of Israel because it has brought destruction, dispossession, and displacement upon their communities. Today, Palestinians continue to oppose Zionism because the state of Israel has killed their loved ones, subjected them to occupation and apartheid rule, pushed them off their land, and committed ethnic cleansing campaigns to erase their presence and history. So, quote, what did the victim feel as he watched the Zionists arriving in Palestine? What does he think as he watches Zionism described today? For the Palestinian, Zionism has appeared to be uncompromising, exclusionary, discriminatory, colonialist praxis. It has been impossible for Arab Palestinians to see Zionism as anything except an ideology and practice keeping them and Israeli Jewish people imprisoned, end quote. I mean, there's more here, but I'm just going to skip ahead because of our time constraints. Anti-Semitism, like all prejudices, is learned. It has been baked into society. Just like white people can be unintentionally racist by perpetuating negative stereotypes about people of color, non-Jewish people can learn, internalize, and repeat anti-Semitic rhetoric just by living in our society, which is something we talk about every week, pretty much. It can be hard when we encounter an activist who we think is unintentionally using anti-Semitism in their criticism of Israel or Zionism, and it's a good opportunity to listen carefully, to call in, to educate, and to build closer relationships of understanding and solidarity. So, yeah, I think I'm going to stop there. I'm going to post the link to this particular post and the account that it comes from, which is Frontline Medics, in the show notes for today. But there's lots there. Do you want to comment?
No. Thank you for sharing all of that, because it's important. Because for so long there's always been this understanding, or it's been taboo to speak out about Palestine and Israel for fear of being branded and or labeled and being an anti-Semite, when people don't actually know what anti-Semitism is, or what Zionism is, or anti-Zionism is. So I hope that several-minute conversation you just had is important and valuable to our listeners, because again, we want to make sure that we provide people with information that is relevant, that is useful, and that is coherent, and that is consistent with what is happening today. Now, with respect to everything you just said, Ms. Wells, I thank you for saying that. Something else that we need to discuss before we actually dive into the main topic of this conversation, which is the Fourth Geneva Convention, are human rights. Because what we've learned and what we've understood from the previous 37 minutes of this conversation is that human rights are being violated across the board in Palestine. Now, human rights we defined this about 4 or 5 episodes ago in the pairing of Universal Declaration of Human Rights episodes. And human rights are rights that you get simply on the basis of being born, that you get. I said a month ago, you get these rights from birth to death or from womb to tomb. Now, examples of human rights are the right to life, the right to liberty, the right to pursue happiness, the right to live free from discrimination, the right to control your body and make your own medical choices. Think about that in the context of vaccines. The freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of expression, the right to work, and the right to get an education. Now, human rights is 11 letters, and 6 of those letters spell the word rights. But what's a right? A right is a legal, ethical, or social principle of freedom or entitlement. A right is something you get because it's either legally enforced, it's part of society, or it's a social principle that everybody generally agrees upon. Now, you get, again, I can't stress this enough, you get human rights simply by existing on planet Earth. You get human rights simply by existing on planet Earth. These are the basic level fundamental rights that you, Cat Wells, and me, Joe Nice, and everybody else, the other almost 8 billion people on this planet, are supposed to have simply because we are on planet Earth. Civil rights is a different conversation. We're not discussing that in this episode because civil rights are more involved. They involve legal frameworks and belonging to a particular state and the rights and freedoms as prescribed by a particular state. And they are more specific than human rights. Human rights, you get them because you're human. I
Yeah,
breathe
and I
air.
think
I got blood through my veins. I'm a human being. I can think for myself. Okay, I get human rights. That's it.
yeah, and I do encourage everyone to go back and listen to. There's 2 episodes on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. One thing I want to highlight that you just said when you were talking about this, or defining what rights are and what human rights are, is everyone is supposed to get these. Now, I mean, of course, we all know that, you know, we aren't getting all of our human rights as outlined by the UN Declaration. Uh, we're supposed to get them, but there are varying degrees of what human rights are actually being upheld in various political states or countries.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I just wanted to point that out
Thank you for pointing
because
that
that's
out.
important in this conversation.
Absolutely. And it's going to lead into the next part of this conversation. And so much of what we've seen over the past week online and on YouTube and on the news, where we've seen Palestinians being bombed out of their homes by Israeli missiles. And something that we've heard in various conversations, or at least I've seen in various conversations with dozens of scholars, is reference to the Fourth Geneva Convention. And it's important that we discuss this because so many people are like, well, yeah. Or you'll hear people say, oh, yeah, well, this is a crime against humanity, or this is a war crime. Well, why? Why is it a war crime? Why is it a crime against humanity? The Fourth Geneva Convention outlines the protections for civilians in time of war. The Fourth Geneva Convention outlines the protections for civilians in time of war. So if you go against the articles that make up the Fourth Geneva Convention, that by definition is a war crime. Why? Because there are 196 signatories to the Fourth Geneva Convention. Coincidentally, Israel is a signatory of the Fourth Geneva Convention. They signed the convention in 1951. Also, Palestine is a signatory to the Fourth Geneva Convention. They self-declared themselves as followers of or adopters of the Fourth Geneva Convention in 1982, but they did not officially sign become a signatory to the Fourth Geneva Convention until 2014. So Israel and Palestine are both signatories to the Fourth Geneva Convention.
Okay, interesting. What's coming to mind right now in response to that is Gaza, the Gaza Strip, because that's basically an open air prison.
It is.
There's been blockades. No one can leave. The Palestinian people are basically stateless. It's a highly densely populated region. And that's where most of the bombs that Israel is sending are going right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's important that we go ahead and go over some of these articles that we have here, because some of these articles that we're going to talk about with respect to territories, occupied territories, and the situation in Palestine and Israel are going to be most applicable. So we're going to start with Article 32 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And it discusses prohibition of corporal punishment and torture. And it says that a protected person may not have anything done of such character to cause any physical harm or suffering or extermination. And the prohibition applies to murder, torture, corporal punishments, etc. So if you are an occupying territory, if you're an occupier and you occupy a territory, you are forbidden from torture, murder, corporal punishment. Take a look at what's happening right now with Israel bombing Palestine. Israel is an occupier. Palestine and the Gaza Strip is the occupied territory. This is what's happening now. Article 33 is also noteworthy with respect to all of this. It talks about individual responsibility, collective penalty, pillage, and reprisals. And it says in the article that no protected person may be punished for any offense he or she has not personally committed. Collective penalties, and likewise all measures of intimidation or of terrorism are prohibited. I'm going to read that second sentence again. Collective penalties and likewise all measures of intimidation or of terrorism are prohibited. Pillage is prohibited. Reprisals against protected persons and their property is prohibited. Take a look at what has happened recently with respect to homes being bombed. The Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, where the Israeli police tried to kick out a dozen families out of East Jerusalem to move Israelis into that neighborhood. Again, more of the articles, because again, these are important pieces of conversation. The next article I want to make sure that we discuss is Article 49. Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Article 49 discusses deportations, transfers, and mass evacuations. And this is with respect to occupying powers. And it says that an individual or mass forcible transfers, as well as deportations of protected persons from the occupied territory to the territory of the occupying power, or to that of any other country, occupied or not, are prohibited, regardless of motive. So if you have people in an occupied territory, you can't take them to your occupying territory. You can't move them. It's illegal. That's against the Fourth Geneva Convention. And we've seen plenty of examples of this with respect to Israel and Palestine. We've seen property being taken. We've seen Palestinian settlers move from one place to another against their will. Again, against international law. Another article that is important is Article 50. Article 50, and it talks about the welfare of children. I mean, I don't think I need to go ahead and read the actual article itself. It talks about the welfare of children, and we've talked about how many children have died as a result of the Palestinians being bombed by Israel, and I'm sure there are some Israeli children that have been bombed as a result of Palestinians firing rockets into Tel Aviv. It's sad on both sides, but we want to make sure that we frame the situation properly, and the asymmetry of this military intervention from Israel towards Palestine. Another article that we want to make sure that we discuss is Article 53, and it talks about prohibited destruction. Article 53, prohibited destruction, which basically says you can't destroy somebody else's property. It's against the law. You can't do it. I'm going to find the actual actual article here. That way I can read it to you properly, because it's important that we get everything right. Prohibited destruction. And it says here that any destruction by the occupying power of real or personal property belonging individually or collectively to private persons or to the state or to public authorities or to social or cooperative organizations is prohibited, except where such destruction is rendered absolutely necessary by military operations. Think about what happened earlier on this week with with Israel destroying the communications center and the news for Al Jazeera and the AP. And they said that Hamas set up an office in that area. So with that
they provided no proof of that. They have still not provided any proof of that. I want to just make that really clear.
Yes, provided no proof of that. So that last clause where it says, unless it's necessary through military operation, is going to be the escape clause for Israel to continue to bomb Israel. So they're going to bomb whatever homes they think they're there, because they could say through military intelligence that there might be Hamas there, or there might be some terrorist activity in this particular neighborhood. And we had to bomb that particular area for the protection of Israeli citizens. That's most likely going to be the justification that they're going to use to continue their bombing. And unfortunately, that is everybody's a signatory to this. That is what is there in the document. And it's a shame that it is happening, but that's one of the rules. And we want to make sure that we understand what's happening here. Another important article to outline is Article 55 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And this one is important because it not only applies to what's happening currently, but it also applies to vaccines. It says here, to the fullest extent of the means available to it, the occupying power has the duty of ensuring and maintaining, with the cooperation of local and national authorities, the medical and hospital establishments and services, public health and hygiene in the occupied territory, with particular reference to the adoption and application of the prophylactic and preventive measures necessary to combat the spread of contagious diseases and epidemics. Medical personnel of all categories shall be allowed to carry out their duties. If new hospitals are set up in the occupied territory, and if the competent organs of the occupied state are not operating there, the occupying authority shall, if necessary, grant them the recognition provided for in Article 18. In similar circumstances, the occupying authority shall also grant recognition to hospital personnel and transport vehicles under the provisions of Article 20. Think about how few people in Palestine have received the vaccine. Yeah. Think about how many people have been injured, wounded, and or killed as a result of these missile strikes, and have not been able to receive medical care, or if they do need to receive medical care, they need to have special permits and or permissions to leave the Gaza Strip to go into Israel or to go into Egypt. Mm-hmm. There's been plenty of literature available with respect to preventable diseases in the Gaza Strip and how lack of medical care, because Israel is not allowing Palestinians to get the medical care that they need, is becoming a massive problem. And when we talk about healthcare and healthcare being a human right, we need to refer to Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which essentially says that healthcare is a human right. We're supposed to have healthcare. Why? Because we're human beings. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this is a big one because I saw a post this morning actually by Al Jazeera saying that, what's going on is that Israel is basically sending bombs to neighboring locations where the medical infrastructure is also going to be impacted. So they're not directly bombing a medical center, but what they are doing is they bombed the main road that gets people to the medical center. So now vehicles can't go on that road. They also bombed a building really close to the only COVID-19 testing center in the Gaza Strip. So it's been destroyed. So, when we're talking about these conventions that all of these countries have signed, including our own, we're talking about ways, and sort of relating it to this circumstance, is we're talking about ways in which Israel in this instance is getting around some of these conventions by doing things like that, like bombing the building next to the only COVID-19 testing site in Gaza. There's lots of information online. Please do your own research about this circumstance. But there's, when you look into it, it's pretty obvious that Israel is has always had, and continues to do things that are totally legal in their biased system, but they sort of do things to get around what these conventions outline, and that's why I think it's so important to outline that. And thank you for doing such a brilliant job, Joe.
I'm just here. We're a team. You understand that?
Of course.
Another, and then we got about a handful of minutes. We've got 5 minutes left. Another article that I want to make sure we discuss, which is related to Article 55, which talks about food and medical supplies for the population, is Article 56, hygiene and public health. And it says, to the fullest extent of the means available to it, the occupying power, in this instance Israel, has the duty of ensuring and maintaining, with the cooperation of local and national authorities, the medical and hospital establishments and services, and public health and hygiene in the occupied territory. So it's basically quite similar to Article 55, where it talks about food and medical supplies and making sure that everybody has food and articles and medical supplies, and the occupying power has the duty of ensuring that food and medicine get to the occupied population. Article 56 talks about hygiene and public health. And again, take a look at what we have here in Israel. I'm sorry, not in Israel, in Palestine. There are people in Palestine who don't have food. There are people in Palestine who don't have medical supplies. You mentioned the road that was bombed near the COVID-19 testing facility. We talked about Article 56 and how the occupying power, in this instance Israel, is responsible for the public health and hygiene of the occupied territory, which is Palestine. There are parts of Palestine that get electricity for 4 hours a day. Water, clean water is an issue. WASH facilities are an issue, and WASH stands for Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene. It's an acronym, Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene, and you see that acronym bandied about in global public health. So it's important that we have these conversations, because it's horrible that the way that Palestinians are being treated. There's about 2 or 3 more articles I want to go ahead and outline, and then we'll wrap up with a conversation about censorship. And again, Article 62 talks about individual relief, where it says, subject to imperative reasons of security, protected persons in occupied territories shall be permitted to receive the individual relief consignments sent to them. So if you have supplies sent to you from UNICEF, the International Red Cross, you are allowed to receive those relief consignments. And the occupying state cannot prevent those relief consignments from being delivered to the people in occupied territories. 2 more. Go ahead.
I was just going to say the blockades in Gaza prevent that, and also the road that got bombed that is going to the main medical facility in Gaza. I mean,
yes,
it's so blatant.
You're seeing it. You're seeing it. Actually, really one more, because we're running out of time. It's going to be Article 76. It's for treatment of detainees, and it talks about protected people accused of offenses shall be detained in the occupied country, and if convicted, shall serve their sentences therein. They're not. You can't take a detainee from one country, from the occupied state, and deliver them to the occupying state. That's against. That's also what Article 77 discusses. So I urge each of you, want to learn more about the this 4th Geneva Convention, because there's a lot more that we could have talked about this. We only have an hour. It's important that you understand some of what we talked about today with some of these articles, and go back and listen to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights episode, because there are some articles that apply to what we talked about here. We talked about the right to work. We talked about the first 5 rights of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It highlights and illuminates the apartheid state that Palestine is living under. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for outlining that. I will definitely put a link to the 4th Geneva Convention in the show notes, so everyone can access that easily. And in the last minute or so, I just wanted to mention something that's actually really serious, which is censorship, because Israel has a really powerful technology surveillance system and advanced technologies in general. Now, I mean, we could talk about this for a whole hour, which we might eventually, but I just want to urge everyone that sees this and wants to amplify our message, please share widely, because this conversation is being censored, and yeah, I mean, Palestine deserves more than what they're getting, because Israel has a really powerful censorship presence in technology, which is the main way we communicate these days.
Yes, and we've talked about this in the whistleblower episode.
We
How
did, yeah.
Jamal Khashoggi's phone was tapped by an Israeli security firm. We discussed that. So,
Yeah.
anyways, we have to go. Kat.
We do. Thank you so much, Joe, as always, and thank you everyone for listening. Take care.
Peace.
Peace.